Act. It came in 2013, but and we've had a regulator since May 2016, but commencement only started on 1st of July last year. And the Act provides for a 12-month grace period before the penalties kick in. So it is law, but the penalties kick in on the 1st of July this year. It applies to all organizations, public, private, absolutely everybody, churches, volunteer groups, any kind of organization that is processing and managing personal information, unless it's for personal use. So what does it apply to? POPI applies to information about natural, living, and juristic persons. It applies to all organizations in South Africa, all entities outside South Africa who process personal information in South Africa. It also applies to private and public sectors, and it governs the cross-border flow of personal information, is one of the things that it's particularly concerned with. Exclusions are purely household or personal activities, sufficiently de-identified information. So when you really can't re-identify the information. Then also, obviously, journalism, art, judicial process, the sort of normal suspects where this type of thing gets excluded. You'll know if you're in that list. What does processing mean? When POPIA or POPI talks, I'm going to say POPI, Protection of Personal Information, or the POPI Act. So when the POPI Act talks about processing, it means these types of things. Any operational activity, any set of operations, whether or not by automatic means. So it could be a paper filing system, for example. Any collection, receipt, or recording of personal information, the organization, collation, and storage of it, updating, modifying it, retrieving, altering it. In fact, consultation or use of the information. So in other words, if I read your monitor, if you open your phone and I read somebody's personal information, that is processing personal information. Disseminating by means of transmission, it's very vague, but essentially emailing or sending or whatever it is, FTPing. Distributing or making it available in any form. So it doesn't matter whether it's an image, a fingerprint, a video, a document, a data element, the databases, the way we're going to be talking about it, paper format, whatever it is. Personal information is personal information. And then also processing is merging and linking, which is something that's very relevant for today. Processing is also the restricting and degrading of in other words, sort of redacting it or in some way sort of making it less, degrading it in some way. Erasure or destruction. So when we get around to actually destroying or deleting information, POPI governs that as well. Okay, so it's very broad. So processing for IT people normally means something very specific. For POPI, it means literally everything, including printing it out on a piece of paper, putting it in a filing box, sending it to Metrofile. That is processing PI. Metrofile in that point is processing PI. Right, so who are the role players in POPI? We have a responsible party, a data subject, and an operator. If you're familiar with GDPR, I'm going to try to remember the GDPR terms because I always get a moment of dyslexia when it comes to comparing the two. But the responsible party would be the... Okay, wait, I'm not going to do this right now because my brain is too scattered. Nonetheless, the responsible party is the organization. The controller, thank you, the controller. The data subject is the PI principal, and the operator is the processor. So yeah, I do know. So the responsible party is basically the organization who calls the shots. They're generally the ones that collect they're the organization that collects the information from the data subject, and they determine the purpose or means of processing. The operator would generally be your third party. So if you use SurveyMonkey to send out a survey, SurveyMonkey is your operator and you are the responsible party. And the data subject is the people whose information is captured in SurveyMonkey. All right, and then a data subject is any natural living person, but also a juristic person, and that's a difference with GDPR. GDPR does not cover juristic persons. A juristic person is any legal entity. So, for example, a company, a registered company, where the information about the juristic person is also protected. So that is an increase in scope over GDPR. Another thing to know is that obviously the types of personal information. So guys, there's a couple of different acronyms for this. There's PI, which is personal information. There's PII, which is personally identifiable information. They're the same thing. Okay, pretty much the same. GDPR, POPI have a very similar outline of what PI means. And I want to point out at this point, it's not just GDPR, okay? There's privacy legislation all over the world, all right? So Australia have a very strict Protection of Personal Information Act as well. Howard, Allison's knocking on the door asking to be let in.
Okay.
So if we, is information relating to identifiable living persons, so any information relating to that person. Okay, so anything that you can use to identify that person. So it doesn't have to be their full name and ID number. It can be literally where they were at a time and place where you could extrapolate who the person is. So for example, if I talk about the headmaster of Saxe High School in 1986, you will be able to figure out who I'm talking about. So that is personal information. Special personal information is religious or philosophical beliefs, race or ethnic origin, trade union membership, political persuasion, health or sex life, biometric information. So there'll be face scans, iris scans, fingerprints, voice biometrics. And then any criminal or objectionable behavior, because it's quite broad. So special personal information has a special category, and we'll talk about that a lot today with the risks. And then personal information about children. A child in POPI is defined as anyone under the age of 18. Okay, just to be aware that different legislations around the world have a different interpretation of what a minor is. GDPR, for example, sets that age at 13, and for the express purpose of consent. So anybody over the age of 13 years old is allowed to consent. In South Africa, it's over 18 years old. Okay, so just to be aware, all right? There are 8 conditions of lawful processing. So when we talk about lawful processing, this is the crux of it all, right? This is the common theme you'll find in all privacy legislation. And in POPI, we talk about the 8 conditions. And Howard, if you could just mute, someone's got their microphone on. So in POPI, we have 8 conditions. In GDPR, you have principles. They don't match up 100%, but they're pretty darn close. And you'll see with all of the privacy legislations, they're all pretty much the same. The goal is to achieve this level of processing with any processing that you do. Okay, so any PI processing, you need to go through accountability, processing limitation, purpose specification. In other words, you only process the data for the purpose for which the person knows that you're doing it. All of this, it's a lot to read through, but just think about it from this point of view. When Cambridge Analytica, you all saw that documentary about Cambridge Analytica, you would have all felt surprised about the way that your data had been used by Cambridge Analytica. These conditions are aimed at making sure that you don't get that surprise, right? So in other words, if I'm going to use your data, I need to tell you for what purpose. If I collect your data, I need to tell you why I'm collecting it. That's openness. Then when I go and I actually use it, I must use it for the purpose I told you I was going to use it for. If I'm going to use it for something else, the further processing, there are limits to how much I can use it for, right? I can't use it for some random purpose, like, you know, figuring out your political affiliation. And the information must be up to date. It can't be inaccurate, okay? You can't have the incorrect home address of the person just sitting there for years on their record. It has to be correct. Security, we all know about that. That's the obvious one in data protection, having things secured. So, you know, making sure the confidentiality and integrity is maintained. And then data subject participation is a whole other game on its own. That's another whole POPI point where the person, every data subject, you as a data subject are allowed to contact your gym, for example. So let's say you've got a gym membership. You're allowed to contact your gym and ask them, what information do you have about me? I want you to delete all my biometric information. I want you to stop processing my information. And you're allowed to make those requests. And POPI says your gym has to give you the means to make those requests. So if that kind of makes sense. So that I'm going to gloss over that because that's not really the focus for today, but just to know that lawful processing is a key part of POPI. The other point, though, is that before you even start processing the data, you need to have a justification for it. And there's essentially, it's kind of 4, but kind of 5 justifications. The legal, so obviously you have to do it by law. You have to do it under contract with the data subject. So you as an organization have a contract with the data subject. So if I have a gym membership, I have a contract with the gym, they have a contract. So therefore that's their justification. You can also process it to protect legitimate interests of yourself or a third party or of the data subject. So your cardiologist will say, well, I'm going to hold on to your information because it's in your legitimate interest. there's it's sort of a caveat around that there hasn't been a prior objection to processing before you get to consent, okay? And everyone always gets worried about consent. Consent should be your last point of call, but there are some instances of POPI where you have to get consent, and we'll talk about that today. And that's one of the risky areas that we'll talk about. And just to point out what consent is, it's got to be documented. So in other words, you've got to have an audit trail, okay? You've got to know when I gave you consent and when I stopped giving you consent, so that you know that between this time and that time, consent was granted. It was obtained prior to processing, okay? You can't start processing. So for example, direct mailing. You can't send the mails to people before they've consented to the direct mail, okay? Consent must be voluntary, specific, and informed. In other words, I must tick the box. I must say, yes, I want to subscribe. If you're sending out a subscribe list, you subscribe to our list and it's pre-ticked, that is not an opt-in, okay? You're telling the person to opt out. And POPI is very clear. It's now opt-in, not opt-out, okay? So it's got to be very specific. I'm sending you a newsletter for a specific purpose. I'm not going to start sending you newsletters about every other random hobby I have. And it's got to be informed. You need to know what I'm going to do with your data and what I'm going to do about it. And then consent can be withdrawn, and you do need to keep track of this. And as data managers, this is important. Consent is not a yes/no flag. It's an audit trail. Okay. And that's it. We will jump in.
Caroline, so there's just one question there. So it said,
sure.
On one of the slides, it said POPI protects juristic persons, i.e. companies. So, for example, would machine data be covered the same as personal information like names, addresses?
Machine data as in IP addresses and MAC addresses and stuff like that.
I'm not sure if it's that or if it's related to machine learning. I think it's IoT data, so it's sensor data.
Sensor data. Look, if it is, so look, I would sort of err on the side of caution with this stuff. If it's going to disclose or divulge to me some sort of inner workings or some sort of confidential information about an organization, I would hesitate. I would sort of say, yeah. I mean, especially if it's going to be something that I can pinpoint back to that juristic person. But for this, you need a lawyer. I'm not a lawyer. So I'm just going to say, from my own technical perspective, I feel like if I can use that information in any way to understand something that is confidential about that organization, then I would fall on the side of caution. Yeah. Does that help?
Okay.
Okay.
Should we
stop? Can you take over the screen?
Yep.
Sorry, I want to change my screen. Sorry. Can you stop my share? Thanks.
So just to say, Caroline, I can't see Alison in the waiting room. I have put the link up on WhatsApp.
Yeah, she'll join just now. It's fine.
Okay. So can you see my slides? Yeah.
I can see your slide. Thank you. So which data elements carry the most risk under POPI? Right. So let's go on to the next slide. What we're aiming for with this presentation, sorry, that little slide there was to let you know I'm not a lawyer and this is not legal advice. Okay, number one, very important note. Identify and assess your risks. If you are coming into POPI now for the first time, or even if you feel like you've just got way too much going on your plate, the goal right now is to say to you, look, there are penalties and fines attached to POPI, as everyone loves to point out. What I wanted to do was to just whittle that down to exactly what do we mean by that, okay, and exactly what types of things do we need to worry about. Now, in terms of prioritization, POPI compliance is going to be an ongoing continual improvement initiative in your organization. It's not something you're ever going to be 100% compliant with. But one thing that you can do definitely is monitor and manage the level of risk that you're carrying because of decisions you're making about your data. And what I'm going to highlight to you today is the types of decisions and data and processing that should at least raise a red flag so that you can take it back to your compliance officer and your risk manager and say, look, I think this might be a problem for POPI. Okay, so that's the goal. This isn't to turn you into a compliance officer. This is to help you to have that conversation with your compliance and risk managers. All right, so let's have a look at what the risks look like. Okay, so what I'm basing this on is risk management or risk assessment, and I'm not applying a full risk assessment process here. Normally with risk, you apply impact and you apply likelihood, and you come out with a risk rating. I'm not doing that here. What I'm doing here is I'm giving you a weighting. I'm saying to you, if we're going to take a long laundry list of all the types of things you're going to do with data, which ones should you worry about more? So in other words, if you're going to start doing a deep dive a privacy impact assessment or a risk assessment against your data processing, if you're going to start doing that, which data processing should you start with, right? Which one is more important than something else? This is not saying that it is more risky. It's saying this is where you should start looking for risks. Okay, so I want to be very clear about what the aim of this is. There are three types of risks in regulatory risk within POPI. There's what I call type A, which is essentially your maximum legal liability. And that has got to do with the very infamous 10 million rand fine and 10 years in prison, which compared to GDPR is actually not that bad. But what it is the there are very specific instances of risk that apply that carry the very specific types of data and processing that carry that maximum penalty, which I'll point out to you now. Then there's legal liability, which is basically where you would be guilty of an offence. It's a lesser fine. I think it's a 1 million rand fine and 1 year in jail. And you might be asking, who's that? Well, according to POPI, it's the head of your organization. It's the CEO or the owner of the organization, the information officer under POPI, or the organization at large. I'm not sure how they're going to apply these liabilities, but again, that's for your risk manager. What's important for you is that there are penalties and fines to a lesser extent for legal liability, and then there are civil remedies. And to me, this is a slightly more risky area because civil remedy means that if I get upset with your organization about the way that you process it, so if I go to my gym and they can't give me my data, or I get the feeling that they're not securing my data, or I start feeling like, I'm not happy with the way they've done it, I can actually complain to the regulator about that. If it gets worse and I actually find that my personal information has been leaked, and I find that they're not protecting my information, I can then, if I have suffered some sort of harm because of that, I can start a legal proceeding against them. I can sue them. So POPI gives me, as the data subject, a lot of power to exercise my rights and to get compensation for if my rights are not protected by an organization. Okay. The question is, GDPR has a DPIA requirement. POPI has something, yes. Raylene, GDPR's, you're talking about the privacy impact assessment. That's the DPIA you mean, right? Because it's also called a PIIA or a PIA. So I just want to make sure that's what you mean. If you mean a privacy impact assessment, great. Then yes, POPI has the same thing, but in the regulation. So there's a regulation December 2018 where it's very specifically stated that one of the responsibilities of the information officer is to conduct privacy impact assessments. And it's actually a little different to GDPR. GDPR says that you must do it in specific circumstances, and it's highly recommended to do it, but you don't have to. POPI says very straightforward, you have to do it. And in fact, you need to do a baseline, and then you need to do basically the privacy impact assessment every time there's a change. Okay, so what this will do is help you to prioritize your privacy impact assessments. In POPI, it's called a personal information impact assessment. So it's a PIIA. Okay, am I coming across clearly enough? I feel like my voice has gone croaky.
No, it's fine. Well, it's fine for me, but if anyone has a problem.
No, it's fine, 100%.
Okay.
Thanks, Paul.
All right. So I've put a weighting on this. Obviously, in your organization, this might be different. You might find that civil liability being likely is 5, and because you don't deal with account numbers, maximum offences isn't likely for you. So, but in terms of impact, these are the high impacts in terms of penalty. Okay. All right. So let's go across. So the next slide, I'm going to use that type ABC, and I'm going to use the risk weighting 5, 4, 3. And don't get a fright; it's a horrible slide. But I really don't know how else to show this to you in any other way. I'm sure all sorts of presentation designers are rolling their eyes at me now.
How Howard will have some idea of how to make this look pretty in Power BI, I'm sure.
I'm sure we will, and we'll get better at this. I'll make this more pretty, I promise I will. But just to start at the top, because we all can concentrate for 5 minutes, so what I'll do is just quickly from the top, I'm going to work my way down, and then Howard will get into the interesting bit of interpreting this into actual data management, into interpretation. But just to give you a guideline, if we were talking about the maximum penalty fine, the type A, if you were to look for that penalty in your data processing, you would be looking for account numbers that are not risk assessed or mitigated. POPIA defines account number as any number that, or anything, sorry, a unique identifier of some sort that allows me access to funds. So this has got to do with money. Okay, it's got to do with credit cards or account numbers or whatever it is. And it doesn't have to be a credit card number. It can be any number that gives access. So having that interpreted, if you haven't done a risk assessment on your account numbers, that's your biggest risk. If you have account numbers that are being sent to third parties without a clear reason why it's going to the third party, that's definitely a big risk. And account numbers being sent to third parties with a clear justification, the risk weighting I put down a bit lower because you are within your rights, but it's still account numbers and it still carries a high weight. So yeah, even with a clear justification. So that's the sort of the gist of it. Risk type B is the lower fine, the lower penalties. And this would be sort of child personal information with transporter flow to unknown or unprotected jurisdictions without obtaining prior authorization from the regulator. Prior authorization is not the same as justification. Prior authorization is a process of going to the regulator to say, I send information about children to other countries that don't have whatever, and I've put these controls in place. The regulator looks at it and says, your controls are all good, we're happy with it, and they publish that in the Gazette, the government Gazette. Okay, so it's very, very specific. But the flag for you guys, if you haven't heard about prior authorization yet, if you don't know whether the jurisdiction is protected and you are sending child information to America, for example, then that is definitely a high risk. Special personal information, same story. Credit reporting, you'll know if you need POPI, trust me, for credit reporting. Enhancing personal information for further processing. So in other words, if you are taking data from a third party, combining it with your data set, and using that data for further processing, in other words, not the original reason that you collected that person's data, you have to get prior authorization. So that's one of them. Processing criminal behavior on behalf of third parties without prior authorization. This is a big one because it's not just criminal behavior. You'll see the next one is unlawful or objectionable conduct. So that would include, for example, if, for example, I heard about an app where B&Bs were all had this app in an area, and if one of them had an objectionable guest, they would flag the person in the app. They would identify the person in the app, and then suddenly that person would find they can't check into any B&Bs in that area. You want to be a little careful about that. That's objectionable behavior. And then child personal and then it just goes down sort of the lesser degrees. Direct marketing pops in there. I put in there direct marketing to people outside of South Africa without informed consent, and that's where you start getting into trouble with GDPR and other legislations. You want to be careful, and not just GDPR. There's other legislations like EPR or PECA, which you want to be aware of. Does enhancement also cover handing over emails to Facebook for identifying similar persons? So I'll have to think about that, Matt. Sorry, I'm not sure. Directory services. If you provide directory services, you definitely want to pay attention. If you're sending direct marketing to non-clients and they don't have specific and informed consent in place, that's a problem. POPI has a specific form number 4 in the regulations. You have to send to your direct marketing recipients before 1st of July. If they haven't responded in the affirmative before the 1st of July, you have to strike them off of your direct marketing list. So that is, I think, quite a high impact and quite a high risk for organizations. PI sent to or processed by third parties without adequate contracts in place. You have to have contracts with third parties. So your cloud service providers, your metro files, everybody that you send PI to, your backup tapes, all of that stuff, you have got to have solid, proper contracts in place that include data protection requirements. So I'm going to leave it there. I'm not going to babble all the way through this. One thing I do want to point out is automated decision making carries a level of risk. And then I prioritized conditions 7, 6, and 8 at the top of the list of all the conditions, because those are the ones that people will be the most aware of. If I approach my gym, or if they've done something with my data that I don't know about, I'll find out because of lack of openness. I'll sense the lack of openness. If I go to their website and they don't have the form or a way for me to ask them to delete my data, I'll know that they don't have condition 8. And then that allows me to complain or to create issues for that organization. So for you as an organization, that public-facing interaction it carries a higher risk. Okay, so just to explain that a bit. Sorry, I know I speak fast and I know we've gone through a lot of information, but I want to give Howard as much time as possible to show you what this means rather than me just babbling for hours. So I'm going to let Howard get on to the interesting stuff that you actually came to. So I'm going to leave it there to questions as we go.
There's one more question from Paul. Paul's got his hand up.
Yeah, thanks, Howard. So first of all, I don't think it's quick and boring. This is really interesting conversation. So thanks for that, Caroline. So in your example of the B&B thing, right, where you have a flag for objectionable people and whatnot. So in what has to be done for something like that to be okay from a compliance perspective? So in other words, if I am that person, for example, and the B&B let me know that they're going to do that, they're going to put me on a register or whatnot, is merely by them doing that enough from a compliance perspective, or must I give consent that they can do it?
No, it's not a question of consent. It's prior authorization, so consent doesn't apply. But let me just get the very specific. I'm just going to quickly bring up. I have a cheat sheet because it's not all objectionable behavior, because that's just special personal information. It's in a very specific, way of processing objectionable behavior. Let me just have a look here. So prior authorization applies when you are processing information on criminal or objectionable behavior on behalf of a third party. So in other words, you are not doing it for yourself, for your own purposes. You're doing it for someone else's purposes. And if that is the case, you need to get prior authorization from the regulator. You have to stop processing. You have to request prior authorization. And then when you get feedback from the regulator, or if 4 weeks have passed, then you can continue processing. The one sort of get out of jail free card on that is unless you belong to an organization or membership organization that has issued a code of conduct. So if you fall under, for example, so let's say, I don't know how this works, but let's say, for example, you are a neighborhood watch and you fall under a membership organization that has got a code of conduct that has been ratified and approved by the regulator and published in the Government Gazette. And that code of conduct says that you are able to do this information because of the way that that organization is controlling you, and the regulator is happy with that, then you're okay. So it's kind of specific. Okay. And again, I'm not a lawyer. If the intention of this sort of list is simply to say to you, if you are processing objectionable behavior on behalf of third parties, that is something that needs to be assessed by your risk manager. Somebody in risk and compliance has got to take a magnifying glass and look at what you're doing there.
Yeah.
Okay. That's all this is. This isn't making you a lawyer. Okay. Does that answer your question, Paul?
Yeah, thanks. It's just like.
All right. So it doesn't matter about consent. Does not come into it at this point. Okay. Shagan, you had your hand up.
Caroline, thank you very much. This is very insightful. I just have a very quick question, and this has to do with research. I said, in the event that you completed the research, and maybe after a year or two, you secured another grant, and it's a research that involves adolescents and children. You've secured a new grant, and you want to go back to continue follow-up data collection from that particular cohort of people, and of course, that wasn't contained in the consent that they signed prior to ending that project. So what happens? What are the POPI regulations for this?
All right, so I'm going to answer that in the cautious way. The first thing I'm going to say is POPI does not apply to information that has been adequately de-identified. So generally with research, research practitioners are generally very good at de-identifying information. So it's just around the quality of the de-identification. That's the only sort of checkpoint. But if it is not de-identified information, my honest advice is get a lawyer. Just get a lawyer, understand where you stand with this, and be careful. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you very much. Thank you.
So maybe just one last example from Mads asked the question is, and let's just say we apply to Donald Trump's ban from Twitter. Is that?
So in other words, they're making it quite vocally. They were quite vocal about making it known that he's been banned.
Yeah.
Yeah, so they decided internally that he was guilty of objectionable behavior, and that therefore he has to be struck off. I think in that case he made it publicly available himself. So if the data subject discloses publicly the information, that's a different point. The point is the data subject must be in control. But certainly if I was banned from Twitter, I would not like them to make that news headlines. Unfortunately, I don't think Twitter. I'm not sure exactly. It depends on where they're based. I'm not sure if they are based in Dublin or not. But yeah, it's that's again a little bit of a specific example. But generally speaking, if you as an organization decide you don't want somebody to attend your gym anymore, that's a decision that you don't want to be making that known in general to other people who've got no business knowing that. That would be considered special personal information. That doesn't require that prior authorization stuff, because that's for when you are processing unlawful objectionable conduct on behalf of a third party. It's got nothing to do with disclosing it. It's just got to do with you processing it. Okay, so that's different.
Okay.
Any other questions, corrections? Is it you think I'm not doing well? Okay. All right. Sorry, that took a while. So let's get cracking.
All right. Okay. Would you like to talk about this slide?
No, it's fine. I think just to let you know that privacy impact assessment should look at it from the point of view of the data subject, not the point of view of the organization.
Okay. All right. So, and I think I think I just echo Paul's sentiments. I think from a data management point of view, our understanding of the interpretation is always difficult. I think we tend to pick up on the data management side a lot easier. So happy that we spent time just clarifying that for everybody. So what I've done with from the information that Caroline's given us, from looking at some of the data elements, I've now built what I refer to as a data risk meta model. It's starting to bring out a taxonomy in the different areas. And what I did was I first of all focused on the data asset. And you can see the coloring system that I've created here is the ones in blue are related to data assets, not the data elements that sit in the data dictionary. And you can see on the right-hand side, these are the related DMBOK knowledge areas, so master data. So an example, data subject would be sitting in as master data. There would be a combination of data assets containing the master data plus data elements. So that's why he's shaded that element shaded like that. Now, all of this is what I see the risk meta model. So it's all metadata, but then there are different elements or responsibilities that I've allocated according to the DMBOK. So as an example, I would see data architecture responsible for data flow, and of course that's related to our data lineage area over there. I see the data quality people responsible for the data processing quality control points, and data governance responsible for the data processing agreement. Okay, so the way it goes is the ones in blue are the data asset. Then we drill down into another level of detail, which is data dictionary. Along here, we get our business rules that we have both from a governance point of view, plus the enterprise data model that has the business rules in the data model. plus the data quality business rules. And I did have an interesting discussion with Veronica this morning to say that Di Joseph recommended Graham Witt in terms of doing the business rules, and he's just come out with a really good example of data modeling for data quality. So there's some really helpful information around business rules. How do we model rules? How do we specify them in quality? How do we specify them in our glossaries? And then we've got the critical data element. Okay, so we've sort of, on the first two we've dealt with, and that was a lot of my understanding was been focusing around the data asset and the data dictionary. And this business activity is one that is certainly in a data flow diagram, but it doesn't have all of the elements that Caroline has pointed out in that risk element in terms of that level of business processing that would identify these activities as my risky activities. And of course, there's going to be an aspect of data lineage where that is happening within the data flow diagram. Okay. Now you'll see there that if I go up towards data governance, there's third-party processing that data governance should be aware of. And what we're seeing over here is that business activity is very similar to what lots of people refer to as ROPA, R-O-P-A. I don't know whether, I think that's certainly a GDPR term. Caroline, I don't know if that's a POPIA term, the registry of processing activities. So all of these business activities with respect to where the locations are, GDPR refers to something called ROPA. I don't know if that's a...
No, POPI doesn't specify anything specific like that. And with GDPR, it only applies for I think, specific size of companies or sort of sensitivity of processing. But I think it's generally a good idea. If you can get it right in your data management side of things, that's not a bad idea. Yeah.
Yes, so that's certainly what I've done, and included all of this information in there to be able to produce a ROPA, a registry of the processing activities. Now you can also see in the master data I've allocated consent, the personal information, and then sort of on the right-hand side here we look at that things are important in terms of establishing trust, the accessibility of the data transparency, and another area that we focus on with organizations called data sufficiency. Now, data sufficiency, I think, is something that we're not paying a lot of attention to. And really what we should be doing from a governance point of view is to say, if we have sufficient data to make the decisions that we need to make, then we don't need to collect any more data that puts us into a potential risk situation. So I don't see a lot of people doing it. I don't see a lot of people applying the data sufficiency rules to understand that. But I think we should start to introduce that, and that requires that we have an inventory of our decisions and our business decisions. So it does bring in more elements to the risk model, but that's the core. Then what I've done is I've taken this and gone down another level in terms of if I look at a data asset, these are the facets of the data asset taxonomy in terms of how does it relate to our business capabilities, how is it involved in the business processing. So the capability is that capability cube, and there's an information dimension to the capability cube, and those are information objects or information concepts. I refer to them as the data asset. The business value chain is there as well, and that's related to, and we build up a data value chain. You can see the data value chain in data architecture. So in data architecture, we've got within the asset, those are the subject areas, is what I refer to as a data estate. It maps the estate. And you can see quite often that when, especially in the ROPA, where they say, what subject area does this relate to, what domain, that's the sort of level that you answer in those questions. And then we have the logical model and the conceptual data model. We have data quality, all the different expectations that we have on a data asset, the data quality profiling that's been done to be able to demonstrate that we're looking after the quality. when we look at the data dictionary or the data element, we've now got our logical data model, the business glossary, and the data element. So this is a multifaceted taxonomy that flows off the data asset. We then go into a data element taxonomy. Where is that involved? It's related to, of course, the data subject. What PII information, what SPI information at a data element level are you keeping about a data subject? Then we have the data flow and the data mapping to be able to say that this data element comes from this original data set from outside, or we create it, and how does it move along all the way into a report? What does the data mapping look like? And are there any transformations on the data as you progress? And that's similar to things that we have within BCBS 239 and some of the IFRS scenarios where the accountants have to sign it off, and they have to look at any transformation that's happened on some of the line items on the balance sheet. And in some cases, they have to explain why that mapping or why that transformation happened according to what rules. Okay, so here's just a sample of the data element taxonomy. So Caroline, the answer to your question there is it's not exactly the same as data minimization, but it can certainly be used to reduce the data assets that we have and achieve a data minimization. So if data sufficiency talks to the making of a decision. So, and I suppose we'd have to drill down into the processing. What is the purpose of processing? And if a data element is not involved in the processing, then it doesn't need to be brought in. So the idea is very similar, but it's not exactly the same. Okay, so of course, data quality also gets down to critical data elements and also part of the DQ profiling. So that's almost a data quality profiling at an element level and not at a data set level. And then we go down to the business process taxonomy. This is where we can compile the ROPA if necessary. And you can see the different elements that are related to our business activities. And then we go into a data flow taxonomy, and that gets more complicated because all the data moving, all the different areas, what's happening at a data asset level in relationship to a business activity that's part of a business process, and down to a data element level. And this is where I pick up the risk stuff that Caroline has given me. Okay, so within that data flow for the processing agreements, I can now start to allocate that risk weighting, and I can start to associate it with the different types of processing that we're dealing with. Okay, so that's how I get the risk element coming in that we've got from Caroline. And then the last one is basically a taxonomy for the processing agreement. What are the principles that we're applying on this processing? What is the rights that the data subjects have? What are the processing rules? Processing justification, whether it's the legal justification, and then we have the processing reference data. So that's an example of the taxonomies that I've built from the information that we've got from the data catalog, the metadata and data assets. Are there any questions before we go too far? I know we've almost only got about 5 minutes left. I've got lots of other slides in this and certainly some Power BI rendering. Are there any questions around the taxonomy and basically the risk meta model? So I think it's important that we all understand the elements for data risk, and this is what I see as the superset of data risk elements. Any questions?
This is really useful. And I can see if I've had a bit of experience with some data governance platforms, but what those do is actually just giving a space to have and define all these, connect them, give them some visibility. but it's really useful to just see it in this abstracted way, especially if you start here and then delve into it. You know?
Yeah, yeah. Okay, thanks. So to answer your question, Caroline, it's interesting when we do data flow diagrams as a data architect, we map the movement of data from when it comes in, and there are different levels of detail on the data flow diagram. The first level is really just where the data sits at rest, and we can, a really simple example would be, we have a line of business application, and then we have the ETL from a BI and a data warehousing thing. It then goes into staging. From staging, it goes into transformation. It then goes into the warehouse, goes into a data mart and a report. So that's a data flow. And so we've already got how the data is moving within the organization. The next level of detail in a data flow diagram is what we refer to as the business process or the procedure that caused that transformation, that actually moved the data and did the mapping. And then you link it to your business processes. So it takes some time to get there, and it takes a lot of effort. I mean, I was involved with one engagement, and it took 3 months to just work out just the external data coming into the organization and what processing was happening, business processes were happening for the first person who received it within the organization. So there was a lot of work happening there, and there's a lot of times there's this separation between our data and our data stores and the processing that's happening on it. You can't quickly go somewhere and say, this is what's going on. And it sort of leads me to the discussion we had with OneTrust during the week, where they actually recommended for those people who are desperate to get to the 1 June, 1 July thing on POPIA, they shouldn't worry about data discovery at this point. They should rather focus on the registry of processing activities, make sure their risks are right there, and then when they've got time, because getting to the cloud, getting to all of these areas that bring the data, this can take quite a lot of time, and the people have difficulty in getting all of that data. So they do recommend you start off almost with this data lineage, data processing flow, before you try jump in and understand every single data asset you have. Of course, the problem we have with that is then our data assets are just what the business calls them. If they don't know where it's located or things like that, or they don't know all the details of the data dictionary, then it gets a bit hard for them to answer that. But they have to do it, and they have to get going on that side of it. Does that answer your question? Okay, so if everyone's comfortable with that, Paul, you got your hand up again?
Sorry, I can maybe ask it if you're done. Do you have some more content to go through?
I've got something like 20 slides to go through, but we've got like 2 minutes. So yeah, so ask now. And look, the slide decks will be made available, so you guys can go. What I wanted to show just quickly was these are the data models that we've now brought into Power BI. And you can see this is the overall data model, and you can see all of the dimensions of a data catalog. So we've got classification, we've got personal information type, we've got legislation, the data asset, the data dictionary, the data lineage, the risk type, the risk impact, processing types. So this is a list of all of these elements that you come together. Now the data model is available and you guys can make use of it. It's just to understand that there's quite a lot of information that we need to be collecting for our data warehouse to report properly on that. And I've shown you now by DMBOK knowledge area, what are the DMBOK activities, what deliverables we need to produce, and then what are the processes that we need to define. So you should be able to relate that back to what do I need to do from a data management point of view. I've got the reference data here. There's 174 different codes of all the different elements that we're happy to make available. There's some visualizations that we've got. And this is something that I want to show you. So I'll just show you the Power BI model. This is also available for you guys to play around with. And I do want to state that, guys, this is just a illustrative scenario. So the issues are not always 100%. My identification is not always right, but I can click on a data element, and I can then, it filters now in terms of what type of information is that data element. You can see it's other, customer, employee, what the subject areas are, what data sets it contained in, and then I can go to the data lineage and click on elements within the data lineage, and now I can work with my risk impact, and I can say, well, I've got civil liability possible. So when I click on civil liability, then I'll see which data flows I'm at risk with. These are the 4 data flows I've got risk with. So I've got a challenge with Bitrix, which is an organization. I've got LinkedIn challenges and stuff like that. So it's really just showing us the flow. And then I've got the example ROPA that I've been talking about. Are there any questions? I know you had, Paul. Is there anyone who would like to?
Howard, can I just jump in for a second?
Yes.
Could you just maybe through raise of hand, just do a vote if you would like to continue? Obviously, the intention was to cover a lot more of this content, but I think we should have scheduled it maybe as a 1.5 hour event.
Yeah.
And I'm just wondering if people are able or willing to hang around a bit longer, we can then complete a good recording at least. And then, then we at least have it on record how it does have. And then I want to also jump into just where we are right now with all of this. So Howard, my understanding right now is obviously this is a work in progress.
Yes.
The aim is to make this available so that it is a tool that can be used. Is that correct?
That is correct. Yeah. So everything from the data models to, and so we've got SQL Server with all the data tables layout, the Power BI interface, and all the elements that you need to bring this risk meta model together.
Okay. So just for those of you who can't stay longer, I think let's just explain what this is and where it's going and what the next steps are and how reliable it is. And then for those who can hang around, I think what we'll do, Howard, if you have time and you're willing, is to maybe go through that again a bit more slowly, just to illustrate again what it is that's there, and so that we have the recording available for people to watch at a later date. Is everybody happy with that approach? We're good to go. Okay.
Yep.
Cool. All right. So let's, Howard, if you wouldn't mind, so just by raise of hands, people who want to stay a bit longer, that would be good. Okay. Okay, good. So I think we've got enough to continue. Great. Thanks, guys. So Howard, if you could maybe just break away from this presentation and just maybe just talk about the work group and the activity behind this and where we are with that. Because obviously I know from my point of view, this does need more quality checking and reviewing just in terms of accuracy against the POPI Act. And just to obviously to make sure that all the interpretation and the detail is all lining up correctly. I know we do have a leg of work there. But maybe just explain from your point of view where this is going to go and how this, how this eventually will become something helpful.
So this was our initial discussion that we had, Caroline, in terms of what it is that we wanted to tackle with this community project. We spoke of the breach data mart and the impact assessment data mart, and then the taxonomy and the data warehouse, plus the data asset catalog. Okay, so that's the overview that we have of this joint venture that we wanted to do in terms of tackling and building the data models and taxonomies to show people the type of data that they need to implement. If they want to use the community model, it's open, that's available. I agree with Caroline that it's helpful to get it all checked and vetted and things like that. So I believe a lot of the data models there, the actual data is sample data. So that can be changed very quickly, but it's the way in which the data interacts and the way in which we can build a data warehouse to populate the different data marts that we require. So that was the first step that we worked through in terms of the breach data mart. What were the questions, and to build a breach report. Then it's PIA questions, which we haven't got to. Then it was this protection ontology / taxonomy and the enterprise data warehouse. And then it was the data asset catalog. So those were the 4 phases. Now, what we've got is we've got aspects of a large implementation, a large percentage of this implementation across those 4 phases. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, so just to iterate to everybody, just to repeat to everybody, if you weren't in previous meetings, the aim of this entire exercise is to create a usable and useful tool to enable you to satisfy particular use cases, right? So if we think about specific situations where you have to report on a data breach, for example, or where you're asked to conduct a PIA or a privacy impact assessment or a DPIA or a personal information impact assessment. So those kinds of practical outputs that you may, as a data manager, be asked to produce. What work do you need to do? What do you need to have available in your data in your data management setup in order to do that quickly and accurately? And what we were doing today with the risk management is to say, when you're tackling that, if you'd had a data breach and it had to do with account numbers, or if you had a data breach and it had to do with personal information about children, then that obviously should take a higher priority over maybe data breaches of other types of PI. But ultimately, you have to get through all of it. But obviously, we have to prioritize. So the goal is just to make sure that the tools are available, the translation from the legislation into data management is available so that it can be done systematically and with some level of accuracy. But obviously, it's a lot of work. So we have a work group that are working through this. And I think, Alfred, Howard, are we still open to people joining that?
Yes, certainly. So anyone who would like to contribute, we're happy. This is certainly not something that we want to control, or I think there's a lot of learning that we all get as we have to build the data models, put in the rules, and understand all the elements of these different assets and catalogs and stuff like that.
Mads, you had a question?
Yeah, I'm trying to follow you guys on this one. I'm not too technical myself, so I'm puzzling with understanding your path here. But I think it's extremely interesting to see it. But what I'm just wondering is how can you operate a model where you sort of separate the protection ontology from the data assets? You mentioned, for instance, children.
So, man, sorry, that it's just okay. So maybe to explain it, we wanted to start with the data marts first, just to say these are the questions that a data mart needs to answer, and with both of them, that's the one thing. Then we said we'll come back to the data warehouse layout and provide a layout and a taxonomy of the information within that. But then we realized that we need to build a data asset catalog that will feed this information over and above the information that you get from your systems, i.e. customer, the vendors, all of that type of stuff. So you'll get your data asset catalog that will be maintained by your governance and your metadata. So this is almost a metadata store that would feed into the warehouse to support the reporting. So it's just the phased implementations that we brought about.
Okay.
So you certainly, we have the asset catalog that I've shown you the data models for. I make use of an application where I build this, and I feed that into a data warehouse that can be used to support the reporting. So an example of that within the breach reporting was how many customers are affected. There were 5 questions that we put together. what were the assets involved, what was the level of exposure, and what was the processing. So those are the type of things that we needed to be able to answer.
All right.
So Howard, do you want to maybe take a step back and just walk us slowly through some of the go through the slides, maybe starting at that the first sort of layer cake view that you had.
Okay. Paul?
And then take us into that next step.
Yeah. Paul? Did you had a question on this one, Paul?
Yeah, I think continue. I think it'll be more valuable to let you go through the other content.
Okay.
Thanks.
All right. So, guys, happy to have as many questions as you like on this situation. So I don't get stuck. Keep on explaining. So this is what we refer. This is what I refer to as the data risk meta model. This is almost what we have in terms of that data asset catalog. I've called the final design, and you'll see that design on the BI on the data warehouse as a data catalog. Okay. So within that, my four major areas are the set of data assets, and these are all the metadata aspects related to a data asset. So, for example, what is the asset value of this data asset? So that helps us with some of the areas of risk and continuity and areas where we have to understand the value that we have on these assets. We also have a requirement to understand the ownership of the asset. So if you look at my one example or on my Power BI, we can see that for every asset, I need to have an allocated owner within the organization. So who is responsible for professional data within the organization? Who's responsible for employees? And where I don't have it, I've got to add that data ownership to that data assets and make sure that we have it available. And then on the business glossary, it's a case of, can I explain and can we define what these data assets are all about, what terms they use, down to the data element level. So you'll find certainly the way I tackle it is when I start with my business glossary, I first of all come in at a business subject area. So what is the layout of my data estate? Within a subject area, I go to the conceptual model. That gives me business concepts. What are the business concepts? High level, customer, whatever that may be. And then we drill down another level to our logical data model, which then brings out the attributes of the business concepts. Of course, all these attributes need to be defined, and we typically use the logical data model to define the meaning of those attributes. So what does gender mean? What is what are all these? What are the definitions of all of these attributes related to the data subject? Okay, so that's what this row over here is what the data architect is responsible for. So they have to produce a data flow. They typically they are the people that relate the data architecture to the business architecture. And we do that by mapping to business capabilities, business value chains, and business processes. Okay. Of course, they are also responsible for business rules. That is at a data element level. So if we have an enhancement or if we derive a field in a certain way, they have to describe the business rules that we use to do that enhancement. And that's really helpful when you are required to explain what happens and how do you get to that next level or that next enhancement level on your data asset. And then from the asset, we go to the data dictionary, which is really a grouping of all the data elements for the data asset. So we can see that a data dictionary overlaps the data asset. Its parent is the data asset, and then it has all the data elements. But you can certainly start on the data element is linked to a business glossary, a business term. And if you filter on the business glossary term, then you'll find all the elements and all the assets where that term is defined. Okay. And then, certainly what we do at this level is we start bringing in those personal information classifiers. Okay, so for this data element, do they have any PI type attached to that data element? Now, a lot of times within the organization, we wouldn't be worried. We would bring all the data elements in, but certainly from a risk point of view, we would only be interested in those elements that have an associated PI type to them. Okay, and I like to bring in the idea of a critical data element, and that helps me with the sort of processing that Caroline has put there in terms of account number. Fantastic, I've got a critical data element. Child PI, so now if it's under 13, I've got to have age within that. All the elements, all that processing stuff that we've got, it helps me filter out the critical data elements that I need to start with and then give them the appropriate rating. From there, I can look at what is my data processing on those critical data elements, and I refer to that as business activity, and I can now pick up my data risk or my risk calculations on that. Are there any questions, any more information that you'd like me to share with you about this? Bryn, cheers. Paul, is that answering your question, or do we need to go a little bit further? Should we discuss it now?
Yeah, my question was around just again, this is such a useful picture. You know, just from an orientation point of view. My earlier question was, I mean, the conversation has moved on a bit, but I think it's still relevant. But it was about if we do need to do all of these things, are there ways and mechanisms to use to just kind of filter things down and get to a path? I mean, like yeah. Caroline said earlier, you know, you start with your riskiest risks, or you use something words like that, Caroline. But similar to that, maybe the question is, okay, so let's say that we do identify that. Would you go from there and then I mean, what is a typical path you get to get all these things? It's going to take a lot of time, right?
Yeah. So let me try to give you that answer, and this is why I included this slide. I mentioned earlier on the data discovery that people are engaging on at the moment, and it was interesting. I went after having a discussion with OneTrust, and they highlighted this scenario of people aren't going to make it if they start off this exercise by doing a data discovery. What do we mean by data discovery? It's going to be finding all the locations of our data, what the data assets are, and what the data dictionary is. Right? So those are the two aspects of the meta model that data discovery brings into play. So you've got Informatica that does it, and what she's saying is you'll typically look, if you single thread on this, you'd look at 6 months before you completed your data discovery. On average, they're saying that's what it's taking organizations. I didn't get numbers and sizes. She just said, be careful of this. You've only got until June. So how do we get there? So this is what I'm suggesting, is that there's a initial definition from a policy point of view in terms of defining your data privacy policy. And part of that is what I've defined here as the ROPA/data mapping. Right, so we'll need a policy and guidelines on how to build that data mapping that would be then sent out to the business departments, and they would start to complete that data mapping. So those are the processing activities that they got, and that can be shown. I can show you sort of what it looks like within Excel. It would look something like this, and there's some really. I've got some slides on good practice in terms of what a ROPA should contain. And so let me go back to that slide. I think it's over here. Sorry. So this is a good practice for that registry of processing activities. All right. So we are saying you build a register, and then if you can just focus on the steer that Caroline's giving us in terms of your high risk. So just focus on those processes. And those processing activities are, so information required for privacy notices, records of consent, controller processor contracts, location of personal data, DPIA reports, records of personal data breaches. So that's a good practice for a registry of processing activities.
Yeah.
So that's what they're saying is tackle next in terms of that, and then start to bring in your data retention and deletion and cleanups and things like that, so that when you're looking at your discovery, you've gone through and dealt with a lot of the data that's just hanging around. So your data discovery is less in terms of that. So this is an idea of how to tackle it. Mads, you got your hand up?
Yeah, I'm just thinking, why do you want to put that much effort into a ROPA, which I consider the same as also you need some kind of library of your handling of personal data in the GDPR terms, if you have already a process map of your business processes?
It's probably when you don't have that. But even if you do, you'd almost just catalog and then put them and associate the risk level with that. So if you've got a catalog of your business processes, you would then use the risk rating and start to allocate a risk rating to those processes.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, I've also been working with data stream analysis for the preparation of GDPR some years back, and then still is. And what I've experienced is that you might have some semi-level of process documentation, but never down to the element of actually talking data connected to the process. But when you then take the business processes and enrich them with the data layer, you're actually quite well off. And then, of course, you'll have the risk connected to your data objects. At least in my experience, that the hardest thing is you can have one data object or one data attribute, and in itself, it's not that critical. But compared with maybe 10 or 15 other either records or data objects, it suddenly becomes a much more explosive package of data that has a higher risk. So the combination of data attributes and the raised risk, I think, is the most complicated thing to express.
I agree with you. The challenge that we're trying to put now is for those people that don't have an understanding of they don't have a data asset catalog and they don't have a data dictionary. Where do they start?
Yeah.
I think that's the important one, Paul, and I think that's the question that you're asking, right?
Yeah, yeah. It's related to that. Now I've been sitting here because it's so for compliance in June. It's a tricky story because it's first about having the visibility of, for example, knowing just where your policies are and whether you have policies or not. Now, I'm thinking more of our smaller customers, not the sort of tier 1 customers, right? Many of them are not, they don't have formal policies necessarily. And for them, it's going to be, from a compliance point of view, it's one thing to be able to actually have the systems in place to do a data subject request, for example, or to handle that when it comes in, versus just having visibility of my policies and what regulations they relate to and what business processes they touch and all that kind of thing. So what I was wondering with this line of thinking is, Caroline, do you know whether, from a fines perspective, is there going to be, is there going to be is intent and demonstration of intent, is that going to be taken into account when the regulator comes and apply fines, for example? Are there sort of layers? Is it a, you know, how do we have any idea at this point in time how that might actually work in practice?
So yeah, look, so POPI is POPIA is a South African law for a start, okay? And South African law is based on the idea of reasonability. So Alison will correct this, but it's based on the idea of like a reasonable measure. So for example, it says that you need to provide reasonable organizational and technical measures to secure the information, right? So in section 14, it talks about security, and it's reasonable, and that reasonable isn't just a random word. That's actually a concept in South African law, and it means reasonable for you in your organization, given the kind of information that you're dealing with, you know, compared to how your peers operate, compared to, you know, given your professional expectations, or maybe so certainly a financial, like for example, credit reporting authorities, organizations would definitely be held to a higher standard than your church group or your, you know, there's different, there's kind of, it's reasonable, like what's reasonable for you. The problem there though, so that's why it's important to look at those penalties, because the penalties give you a bit of insight into how the regulator prioritizes these things, right? So if you consider yourself a fairly low maturity data management organization, so your level of maturity around data management is fairly low, yet you are processing large amounts of account numbers, you know, large volumes of account numbers, I would argue that you have to level up and get your data management maturity up, because you're handling data that the South African that POPIA regards to be highly sensitive, or if you're dealing with special personal information, or if you're dealing with information about children. And you must remember that the aim of all of this isn't purely to be able to answer to the regulator, right? Yes, the regulator will come knocking and they will investigate if people complain, and they definitely will investigate if there's a data breach that they feel is not being managed well. However, the real objective of POPIA is to put South Africa to put our businesses, our industry, on the information highway, right? To give us access to the digital economy, to put us onto the fourth industrial revolution, all of those nice keywords we like. The point is that global trade and global sort of, even if you just think about, so for example, most people that come to me for POPI assessments and POPI help are coming to me because their customers in Australia are coming to them with a due diligence questionnaire that is all about privacy. We're seeing it now in the Deloitte audits and financial audits, coming up with more and more questions about, is it automated decision making? Are you processing information with data protection? Like, are you using encryption? And it's becoming more and more of a melting pot. And the reason is because if we want to get contracts with external companies, or even our own very large corporates, if we want to have work with them, they're going to ask us about our privacy, and we need to level up. Like I think all organizations need to be at a level where we are confident that we understand data protection. So to answer your question, obviously, yes, it's not the same for everybody. But I do think you can't. One thing I will say about POPI, though, there's a couple of penalties in there that sort of say that so for example, you would be guilty of an offense if you did not know something, or if you ought to have known. So in other words, it's no defense to say, oh, but I didn't realize that it's wrong to send direct marketing to people without consent, or oh, I thought that opt-out was okay as a consent. POPI is saying you ought to know. You have a responsibility as the person. There's that you have responsibility to know how this works, and you should be asking those questions and taking accountability for the way you manage the data. But at the same time, obviously, we can't all go off and spend R1 million on data protection.
Yeah.
Okay.
Mads, you've got your hand up?
Yeah. Just a maybe overall question is I think from the beginning you mentioned that POPI has been around for quite a while. The legislation has been around for a while, but now you're sort of getting closer to a border of or a point of no return where you'll actually see fines and DPAs getting into business. Is that sort of the fact?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, look, if you look at what happened with GDPR, they had 2 years grace period before the penalties and fines kicked in. And if you remember correctly, literally a week or two before that grace period ended, your inbox was suddenly flooded with people saying, "Oh, can we keep you on our mailing list? Is that okay?"
I do remember. Yeah.
You remember that?
So I'm just trying to find out if you're sort of at the same at the same point now.
Exactly the same point, and it's no different. Okay. And it's because it's just there's so. I mean, it's not like this is the only legislation people are trying to cope with at the moment. So there's a lot to handle. But what I will say is that if company, I got a promotional email today, and I'm not going to say which company because it's a big group. So. But I got a promotional email today from a technical services company. They provide a software solution. And they're saying, guys, here's POPI, and here's how our tool helps you. This is how our system will help you to be POPI compliant. POPI compliance is not their primary thing, but they're clever enough to realize, they're a service desk. They're clever enough to realize that a service desk and help desk is very core to making sure that POPI is something that can be implemented. So they're leveraging it as a marketing opportunity. And I honestly believe that, like, regardless of penalties and fines, look, we have to prioritize the penalties help us. But if I really was to, like, if I go into an organization, my number one piece of advice is get anybody who's concerned with relationship management. If your customer relationship management, your brand positioning, your public relations arm, your marketing department, those should be the people who should care about POPI more than anyone else. Because this is going to be about trust. It's going to be about relationships. It's going to be about people, how people perceive your organization. Do they perceive you as a mature data? Like, do they believe that you care about the data? And that's perception management. And that comes across. If I call my gym and I say to them, guys, I want to know what data you've got about me, and the person who answers the phone doesn't even know that I'm allowed to ask that question, I'm immediately going to know that they do not care about privacy.
Yeah,
it's good. And I haven't even hit the data mark. Like it's all about relationships and communication with your market, your international clients. If you don't show them a mature and clear perspective or policy around how you're managing data protection, I mean, they're going to hesitate to do business with you. And the problem with that is that we'll go as a country, we will gain a negative brand, as being not mature with data. Like this is the data Wild West.
But then
just
again,
the way that like US has like we all feel that the US doesn't protect or respect our privacy as a general kind of statement about the Americas.
But then again, I think if I was in that situation, thinking 2-3 years back, it will still be to start documenting their own business processes and connect it with the personal data.
Yeah.
Because so that at least makes the first initial step to create clarity of what you're actually doing. I mean, you're lots of people connected under the same roof, but that's not the same as knowing what you actually do for a living. So just defining and harmonizing processes and connecting it to data was the sort of eye opener, at least in my experience in when I was a consultant doing this work years back.
And I think for me, one of the biggest changes is the depth of conversation that's having to happen now between risk and compliance, and the back end the data warehousing teams. The data managers, the master data management team.
I'm actually doing I'm doing a short piece on ThinkLinker's data management marathon in March on this, because I'm trying to catch up some of the experiences from my time. One of the most successful experiences I have was actually combining data management and GDPR documentation and process documentation. So instead of thinking it in three sort of separated lanes, combining it, because it's basically the same It's just expanding the picture a bit.
Mm.
So if you have processes that describes what you do in everyday life, well, attach the data to it, and suddenly you're much better off in terms of whatever compliance framework you're working along.
No, for sure. I mean, for example, you're not going to get through a financial audit quite soon. You won't get through a financial audit without having to explain what a data mart is to your business owners, or explain where the data lake comes into it, or what is ETL. And I mean, all of those things that business owners haven't had to worry about very much in the past, they're suddenly going to have to worry about it because it's very relevant to.
Yeah, maybe it is or maybe it isn't, because if you have anonymized and condensed data in your data marts, they wouldn't bother. But if you have all your customers spread in 10 different data marts with all their personal information, they would bother. So it all depends again on what data you sort of handle in the different processes.
But how many people like that get involved in those decisions? So at the point of making a decision about where the data is going to be stored and how de-identified it's going to be.
Yeah.
Generally, in my experience, it gets left up to techies. It's like the business owners don't generally interfere with that kind of thing or ask those questions.
No, if you have to build up, first of all, your process framework, you need to sort of create a governance structure and adapt ownership of the processes. I was lucky to be doing this in banks in Denmark, and there we had a process governance, so we knew who to connect to, and then we could sort of more easily go through all the process owners and their sort of assistants and define, okay, you're doing this process, what kind of data do you handle? What kind of personal data do you handle? And that, of course, made it easier to build up the documentation, now also GDPR, more GDPR compliant. And then you sort of had all the inside and right to be forgotten procedures that you had to build up on the side. But that's the more core governance of following the compliance framework.
And that was one of my concerns with the whole conversation. The conversations around POPIA is what I feel like people are missing, is that this is the protection of personal information. And we're dealing with information management, data management primarily. That is your first, that's the first capability you have to have in order to comply with POPI. And it doesn't matter what level of maturity it is. You might be doing it in spreadsheets and sort of, just
it doesn't matter.
Kind of conversations because you're a two-man team running a small business. But if you are a large organization, you should know it. So I mean, I'll compare my experience with yours. I had I was speaking to a business owner. They owned their entire business was run from a website. It's an information business via a website, lots of personal information. And I asked the business owner, as my general fact finding, I said to him, how do you handle your IT continuity, right? So what are your IT continuity plans? And he kind of shook his head and he said, oh, no, you'd have to speak to the IT guy about that. And this was a guy who owned a business that runs on a website. It's all web-based stuff. So if he doesn't understand that IT disaster recovery and IT continuity and capacity management, that those are his problem, that's his responsibility for governance point of view, there's no way he's going to spend money on somebody to come and sort out the data ownership and the data governance and mapping and all this good meta model stuff.
Most likely not.
No.
But then you'll have to pay some of the fines.
His IT guy was contracted in. He wasn't even a staff member. It was an external company. So there was no one in the company that understood the data.
So just to add a little bit to that, Matt, is what we are finding with lots of our customers is there is this panic about data privacy, and there is a connection that a lot of the stuff to deal with this is about data governance, data architecture, data quality. And a lot of them are saying, guys, let's do it, but not just solve the data privacy side, but also deal with it as proper data management maturity and upliftment of data management.
Yeah, but I agree on that. But I mean, the approach that I've seen, at least in Denmark, and I can only speak from Danish perspective, is that from let's say the DPA's side, it's been more appreciated that you're doing something, and then maybe not hitting 100% compliance. Then you sort of just sit back and say, well, this is not for me, so I'm not doing anything, because then you'll be hit hard on it. So again, if you can sort of present a status that says, well, we are working towards building and we have certain issues and we know that the issues are these and these and we have mitigations in place and a project plan and so forth, that is always a better position sort of discuss from. And that's been sort of the take from more sides, more of the customers I've been working with. And then they recognize that this is not going to go away. This is something that you need to adopt. And of course, the challenging thing is actually to try to sell it and see it as an advantage. From my perspective, if you document where you have your data and you can document that you have identical data spread across in multiple duplicates across the organization, you could start discussion about refinement of your architecture or reducing or optimizing your architecture. So that is one of the sort of positive side effects that you get from this.
Yeah, no, there's a lot of side of benefits.
It is, but we need to convince them that there is, because otherwise they'll just see this as a pain and call somebody to get the pain go away.
Exactly, yeah. And that's why I think that diagrams like this risk meta model and the discussion, turning the conversation around towards risk will help techies and data people in the back end to have those conversations with business owners, because that's the kind of language that they will talk about. They're not going to want to talk about a meta model. They will want to talk about the risk to the business.
I work with a company that is sort of that sprung out from a consulting company I worked with. They're called Complion. That actually does the same thing, building the GDPR documentation and combining it also with the risk assessment module. It's quite easy accessible system, and it's also supportive of the recurring governance of maintaining your documentation for GDPR.
I always do caution though, get your ownership right before you start using systems. I think get that buy-in first.
Well, one of the mandatory fields in the documentation of the system is put on an owner and her email address. So you're forced by architecture to do that. I'm not recommending a system as the first step in any case, but I've copied in my current position. I've copied the structure into a SharePoint solution that I've managed to build up for quite a short period of time that more or less does the same.
Cool. Good. Well, I think, guys, I'm just cognizant of time. I don't want to turn this into a massive marathon. I think, Howard, what we can do is maybe ask everyone on the meetup to give us an indication whether they would like to continue with this presentation from this point onwards, to go into more of the, sort of more of the modeling that you've done, and unpack that more. Otherwise, we need to find another way of communicating all of this. One of the problems with POPI is that there are just so many different things we have to discuss and so many layers to it that it is a lot. But I do want us to end up at the point where we have a trustworthy and friendly and helpful way of talking about data management to the people who have to manage POPI risk.
So we can actually send out a survey and then just ask people what it is, where they'd like to focus on, and we can give them a list of things. Paul, you had your hand up?
Yeah, I think that's a good idea, and certainly follow-up presentations on this content would be great. Maybe just the last question from me is from I'm not sure if it's a project yet, but this thing that you guys are doing, how do we get more involved? Where is it hosted? Is it a kind of is it a project somewhere, or is it where's the content? Is it in the repository? Those kind of questions. Where are you guys thinking? Well, what are you guys thinking around those matters?
Caroline, would you like to answer what
I was going to defer to Howard. I definitely see this as a Dharma initiative, and certainly being managed, I think, and kind of, because obviously Howard is the central, the key player here. From my point of view, I've developed a lot of information and a lot of knowledge about POPI, and I felt, with dealing with technical teams, that I felt like we needed some kind of conversation to bridge that gap. And Howard has very kindly offered his time and energy into doing this. So at the moment we have meetings, I think it's every second Friday. We have a meeting on Friday mornings. and we're just feeling our way through it. Yeah.
So what we have done, Paul, is we do have a Google Drive for the documentation. So there are things like the mind map, that's for the team. There are certainly the slides and some of the data models, and we've also established a GitHub repository for the data models and we need to populate that and from all this work get it into that repository.
Yeah.
Okay.
So yeah, so there's a lot of work to be done, and like I said, we also want to make sure that it is reliable. We want to make sure it's accurate. We don't,
Yeah.
you know, we don't want it to be unreliable in any way. So I'm very cautious to publish stuff, but before we've gone through a proper vetting process and made sure that it's all correct and accurate. Yeah, certainly I think the more disciplines we have involved in developing it, the better, honestly.
Yeah, I mean, for me, it's just useful because something like this, whether, like, I mean, I work for Ultron, we sell data governance platform, particularly Informatica. But whether you have that or whether you are doing something in open source or doing something in spreadsheets, this stuff is helpful in every situation. You know, it gives you the right framework, the right thinking. The tools are there, or the tools need to be developed, but they still need to be based on good, you know, just good IP and good modeling. So you guys have done a fantastic job in that, and that's why I think, you know, if it's a bit of a project and how we need to just chat about how to deal with it, you know, if it isn't under like a proper open source license, maybe that's the safest thing to do because
yes. So Paul would be happy to get you involved to do that and set that up properly.
Yeah, let's do something like that. It'd be great.
Awesome.
Okay, guys, thank you very much. I think we're just about going on for 2 hours now. So I'll create the survey. So if you do want to get involved, happy to bring people on. There's lots of different areas that can be tackled. Certainly from the data management point of view, you can just see the list of elements that need to be brought together. So thanks everyone for attending. If there's any last question before we go, now's the time. Otherwise, have a fantastic evening. And Caroline, thanks very much again for your help and support.
I'm just making publicly available information available. So I think you're doing the hard work.
In a way that's very useful. So thank you, Caroline. Thanks.
It is very useful.
Yeah, well done, Howard and Caroline. Great session. And I would perhaps like to be involved from a data quality perspective.
Yeah, that would be fantastic.
Think about me, yeah.
Yes. Please, yeah. Just drop us an email. I'm notoriously bad at remembering things. So if you could drop me an email, make sure I don't leave anyone behind. Yeah.
All right.
Well, guys, great session.
Yes. Thanks, Di, for sticking around. I know 2 hours on a Zoom meeting or a Teams meeting is, well, yeah, it's a bit epic. How are you getting your extra points for being a Zoom meeting?
Thanks very much, guys.